This is the Jamaica Information Service, the voice of Jamaica.
You're inside Jamaica Magazine.
Encouraging the information flow, sharing the news and views you need to know.
We are building an informed Jamaica every day. Listening to what you say.
It's Thursday, January 7. It's our pleasure to welcome you to another edition of Jamaica Magazine. I'm your host, Samantha Allen. Coming up, IMF letter of intent should now be ready. Government to settle BOJ obligations in 2010 and sugar harvesting at Frome to resume in about 2 weeks. Later in the show, an international speaker from Trinidad and Tobago is our guest on today's edition of Issues and Answers. Do stay with us. The news in detail after the break.
When you use the road, you need to be aware of how your action affects others.
I go around the corner. Only to see a man stopping on the big road. But some people are crossing on a blind corner.
When motorists have to stop on the green light to allow people to cross, it creates problems.
People just can't walk out on the road, some man. From a corner, from behind vehicle. They need to be more careful, man.
We have overhead bridges, pedestrian crossings and crosswalks. Some of them even have signals to tell you when to cross.
People, walk on the sidewalk. If there is none, walk on the right side. And please, if you can't find a pedestrian crossing, make sure the road clear before you cross. Drivers need to drive good.
But pedestrian need to walk good too.
Walk good.
And now the news. The letter of intent outlining the conditions for a U.S. $1.2 billion loan from the International Monetary Fund should now be ready. Finance Minister Audley Shaw told reporters at yesterday's post-cabinet press briefing that the document would have been ready by day's end. Minister Shaw says the completion of the letter of intent means a decision by the IMF board could be just weeks away.
Once a letter of intent is finalized, it means that the middle management authorities at the IMF have basically agreed with the main elements of it. And so what happens afterwards is that it has to go to a high-level management review, and after that it goes to the board.
At the local level, Cabinet is to have final discussions on the document during its retreat this weekend. Minister Shaw is also reiterating that the matter will be up for discussion when Parliament meets on January 19. Jamaica is seeking the standby loan facility from the IMF to offset the severe erosion of its foreign exchange earnings. The government is to repay most of the cash advances it received from the Bank of Jamaica by the end of this fiscal year in March. The commitment was made by Finance Minister Audley Shaw yesterday. He was responding to concerns raised by the parliamentary opposition and other groups. Since November, the Ministry of Finance has received over $23 billion from the central bank. Most of that, $18 billion, was used to purchase government bonds. Minister Shaw says this was a temporary measure needed to carry the country through the period of adjustment.
Indeed, the $18 billion that the bank provided in December was by way of purchasing tradable instruments from the government, so that at the appropriate time those tradable instruments will be sold into the capital markets. So it is not intended to be a long-term debt that is on the books of the Bank of Jamaica. I want to make that very clear.
The finance minister says the government may need to borrow more money from the BOJ this month, but he says those funds should also be repaid in the calendar year. According to the minister, the government's debt management initiative and expected inflows from the IMF agreement should put the government in a good position to settle all its obligations with the BOJ by September. It could take up to 2 years before investigators can definitely say what really caused the last December's landing mishap at the Norman Manley International Airport. That was a word coming out of a press conference at Jamaica House yesterday. Simone Wolf has the details.
Final word could be a couple years away. But so far, investigators say American Airlines Flight 331 does not appear to have suffered any mechanical malfunctioning, but this possibility has not been ruled out.
The ground-based navigation and landing aids were evaluated by a check aircraft after the accident and were determined to be functioning normally.
The Jamaica Civil Aviation Authority, the JCAA, and the United States National Transportation Safety Board have been examining the flight data recorder. Minister Henry says their preliminary report does not indicate any anomalies or malfunctions with the operation of the brakes, spoilers, or thrust reversers. What is known is that the crew contacted Jamaican Air Traffic Control and asked to land on runway 12. According to the Norman Manley Tower controller, the flight crew was advised of tailwind conditions on runway 12 and were offered a circling approach for landing on runway 30 instead.
The crew repeated their request for runway 12 and were subsequently cleared to land on that runway, with the controller further advising the crew that the runway was wet.
Minister Henry says reports from the flight crew indicate that after initial contact with the runway, they felt that the aircraft did not decelerate normally. However, he says the flight data recorder showed that the rate of deceleration appeared normal for a wet runway. An evaluation of the runway surface conditions at the time of landing is in progress to determine the effect this might have had on the braking forces. Meanwhile, it has been revealed that the aircraft was slightly below the maximum permitted landing weight when it landed in Kingston. At this stage of the investigation, the aircraft wreckage remains under the control of the Jamaica Civil Aviation Authority and will be shipped to the U.S. It will be kept in a secure facility there until it is no longer required for the investigation. But Christopher Raleigh-Bickford of the Jamaica Civil Aviation Authority says those investigations are expected to be extensive and could take a while.
So it could take as much as a year before we even get to the analysis stage. And then what we do then is, as we say, we put everything on the table and we start to think about it in analytical terms. And that can take a long time because there are differing opinions. People, different parties have their own aspects on the accident.
American Airlines Flight 331 overshot the NMIA runway on December 22 as the pilot attempted landing on arrival from Miami, Florida. The aircraft then went through the perimeter fence, crossed a road, and came to a rest on a rock-strewn beach about 175 feet beyond the departure end of runway 12 and about 40 feet from the water line. The aircraft's fuselage was broken into 3 major pieces. There were 154 persons on board. There were no fatalities, but numerous injuries were reported. For JIS News, I am Simone Wolf.
Sugar harvesting at Frome in Westmoreland is to resume in about 2 weeks' time. The process was being halted to allow the cane fields to dry out after several days of heavy rainfall. The Sugar Divestment Enterprise, the SDE, has recommended that the harvesting of the crop be suspended for 10 to 15 days. The factory continued receiving cane up to midday today, but is now in rest mode. According to a release from the Agriculture Ministry, the decision to halt harvesting is necessary because the unexpected high rainfall means the quality of canes remain below acceptable levels. Still, the action has resulted in an increase in expenditure. Meanwhile, mill extraction and other efficiency markers are below target. The Sugar Divestment Enterprise is proposing several strategies to deal with the impact that the temporary shutdown will have on employees. At the same time, the SDE says this temporary suspension of the crop will not affect the supply of sugar to local markets or exports to Italian firm Eridania Suisse. The government has an agreement with Eridania to supply a minimum of 79,000 tons of sugar to the firm. The first shipment under this agreement should leave Jamaica between February 27 and 28. Prime Minister Bruce Golding has asked Jamaicans to pray for God's intervention in the affairs of the nation. Using the analogy of Moses, the Prime Minister says the biblical judge did not lead the children of Israel through the wilderness by relying on his own strength. He adds that leadership